December 31st, 1941. A Navy launch crosses the black water of Pearl Harbor at dawn. Oil still slicks the surface. The Arizona lies 27 feet below, sealed with more than 1,000 men inside her. The West Virginia rests on the harbor floor. The Oklahoma has not yet been righted. Standing in the bow of that launch is the man Washington just handed the wreckage of the Pacific Fleet, 4 days after the worst defeat in American naval history. The officers waiting on the dock are not smiling. There is almost nothing left to command. He looks at the ruins for a long time and says nothing. Then he turns and tells his staff to get to work. No camera captured that moment. No newspaper ran it. But 4,000 miles away, in a windowless room inside the Japanese Naval General Staff, an officer was already opening a file with this man's name on it. Not his ships, not his numbers, him. The strangest part of this story is not what Chester Nimitz did over the next 4 years. It is who understood what he was doing, and who never saw it coming. The launch cut through water that no longer looked like water. Oil had turned the surface of Pearl Harbor into something closer to tar, thick enough that it clung to the hull and left a black ring wherever the wake touched it. Smoke still rose in thin columns from 3 places along Battleship Row, 4 days after the attack, and the smell had not left the air. Men who worked the harbor that week said later that the smell got into their clothes and stayed there for months. Burned fuel oil, scorched metal, and something underneath both of those that nobody wanted to name out loud. Gulls circled low over the water, landing on debris and lifting off again when the swells shifted beneath them. The morning was warm, the sky an ordinary tropical blue, and the ordinariness of the weather made the wreckage below it look even more wrong. Chester Nimitz stood in the bow of the launch with his hands folded behind his back. He was 56 years old, gray-haired, built more like a farmer than a fleet commander, with pale blue eyes that men who served under him would later describe as the calmest thing in any room he entered. He had flown in from Washington 2 days earlier, summoned by a telephone call that told him almost nothing except that he was needed at Pearl Harbor immediately and that the assignment would be permanent. He had commanded the Bureau of Navigation. He had never commanded a fleet in combat. Now he was being handed what remained of one. On the long flight west, he had reportedly said very little, reading through what reports could be gathered and asking his aides pointed, practical questions rather than voicing any opinion about the scale of the disaster waiting for him. The Arizona sat 27 feet below the surface, its hull a jagged shape under the water, more than 1,000 of her crew still sealed inside her. The Oklahoma had not yet been turned back upright. She lay on her side like something that had simply given up, her bottom exposed to the sky in a way that battleships were never meant to be seen. The West Virginia rested on the harbor floor with only her upper decks above water. The Nevada had been run aground on purpose during the attack to keep her sinking hull from blocking the channel, and she sat there still, half a warship and half a wreck. 6 vessels sunk or crippled. More than 2,400 men killed in a single morning by a Navy that had not yet, at that point, fired a single torpedo in anger at the fleet responsible for doing this to them. The officers waiting on the dock did not smile when the launch pulled in. Most of them had not slept more than a few hours a night since the attack. They had spent 4 days pulling bodies out of the water and writing casualty lists that kept getting longer with each new compartment the salvage crews reached. Some of the men on that dock had lost friends they had known for 20 years. They knew exactly what they had left to fight with. 3 aircraft carriers, a handful of cruisers, and a submarine force that had done nothing yet to prove it could matter. One officer who stood on that dock later recalled that the new commander stepped off the launch, looked out at the wreckage for a long moment without speaking, and then turned and told his staff to get to work. There was no speech, no gesture meant for the men watching him, nothing that would have given a photographer anything worth capturing. But the decisions Nimitz made in his first hours at Pearl Harbor would shape the outcome of a war that most of the men standing on that dock believed, privately, was already lost. What none of those officers knew, and what most of Washington would not learn for years, was that on the other side of the Pacific, An entirely different kind of study of Chester Nimitz was already underway. By the spring of 1942, inside the Japanese Naval General Staff in Tokyo, intelligence officers had begun compiling assessments of the new American Pacific Fleet commander. According to historians who later reviewed post-war Japanese records, these assessments were not primarily concerned with ship counts or aircraft numbers. They were concerned with the man, how he made decisions, what pressures moved him, whether his behavior could be predicted well enough to plan around it. Officers assigned to this kind of work pored over what public record existed: service assignments, prior commands, anything that might reveal a pattern, working with the same patience they applied to decoding a warship's silhouette from a grainy photograph. Japanese naval officers had studied their American counterparts for years by this point. William Halsey, in particular, was well understood: aggressive, emotional, quick to respond to provocation. There was a working theory, according to these later historical reviews, about exactly what would make Halsey move and how to use that against him. Nimitz did not fit the pattern. He had spent nearly 4 decades in the Navy without a single famous moment attached to his name. No dramatic rescue, no headline-making command, no political rise built on public visibility. He had commanded a flotilla of submarines early in his career. He had managed fuel logistics for the fleet, a job with no glamour and enormous consequence, the kind of work that kept ships moving but never made a newspaper column. He had taught at the Naval War College, spending long hours on classroom exercises that trained younger officers rather than building his own name. To anyone searching for the usual signals of ambition, the newspaper profile, the political maneuvering inside the Navy Department, the carefully cultivated public image, Nimitz offered almost nothing to work with. According to the historians who later examined these assessments, the Japanese analysis of Nimitz arrived at a conclusion that unsettled them more than any weapon count could have. This man did not need to be seen winning in order to win. That made him harder to provoke, harder to predict, and by their own reasoning, more dangerous than a commander who fought for recognition. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was already proving the point without knowing anyone in Tokyo was watching him do it. The harbor was still burning in places when he arrived. Salvage crews worked around the clock, dragging equipment and bodies out of the wrecks, the sound of pumps and cutting torches never fully stopping day or night. Casualty lists were still being finalized. Most new commanders in his position would have spent their first days touring the battleships, inspecting the wreckage, meeting with the officers responsible for what remained of the surface fleet. Nimitz did something different. He asked to inspect the submarine base personally before he toured almost anything else. Not the battleships, not the airfields, not the shore command facilities, the submarines. He walked the length of the pens slowly, according to those present, running his hand along the hulls the way a man might check on livestock he had raised himself, asking about torpedo supplies, crew morale, maintenance schedules, the kinds of details a submariner would ask, and a battleship officer might never think to. He had begun his naval career there back in 1909, commanding some of the earliest submarines the Navy possessed, boats that were barely more than powered hulls with torpedo tubes bolted on, boats that leaked and stalled and demanded a kind of patience most surface officers never had to learn. He understood submarines the way other admirals understood battleships, or, later, aircraft carriers. Not as a last resort weapon to be used when nothing else remained, but as an instrument capable of strangling an empire slowly, methodically, from beneath the surface, where no headline could easily capture it. While Washington debated what could be salvaged from the wreckage of the battle fleet, Nimitz was already thinking about something almost nobody else in the Navy Department was focused on in those first days: the supply lines that kept 60 million people in the Japanese home islands, fed, fueled, and armed for war. Within days of taking command, he ordered unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. There was no announcement, no press conference, no public statement explaining the strategic reasoning behind it. The order simply went out through the chain of command, and the submarines that had done nothing yet went to sea with new instructions. By the end of 1942, American submarines operating under that order had begun cutting into Japan's merchant shipping at a rate the Imperial Navy's pre-war planners had never accounted for. Japan's entire strategic doctrine had been built around the idea of one decisive fleet battle, a single, overwhelming clash of battleships that would break American will to fight. Nobody in Tokyo had built serious defenses against the slow strangulation of their tanker fleet and their cargo ships. Nimitz had already started that strangulation before most of Washington had finished processing what had happened at Pearl Harbor 4 days earlier. He worked without visible urgency. Officers who served under him in those early weeks described a man who asked careful questions, read every report placed in front of him, and rarely raised his voice, a steadiness that some mistook at first for a lack of urgency and later recognized as its opposite. There was no sense that he was trying to prove anything to the men around him, and even less sense that he cared what Washington thought of the pace of his decisions. He was already thinking in terms of years, not headlines. The fleet he commanded was a fraction of what had existed 1 week earlier, and the empire in front of him had just delivered the most devastating surprise attack in the nation's history. None of that seemed to change how he approached the desk in front of him. He read. He asked questions. He decided. And 4,000 miles away, an intelligence officer in Tokyo was writing down exactly why that quality made Chester Nimitz the most difficult kind of opponent to plan against. The moment that would define Nimitz's command in those first months came not from a ship or a torpedo or a plan drawn on a wall map. It came from a basement. Beneath the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, in a room with no windows and a permanent smell of stale coffee and machine oil, a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort ran a small team of cryptanalysts against the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. The room itself was cramped, lined with long tables buried under intercepted message traffic, punch card sorting machines that clattered through the night, and stacks of handwritten worksheets covered in numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent months learning to read them. There was no natural light in the space, and after enough weeks working underground, several members of the team stopped bothering to track whether it was day or night outside. They worked in overlapping shifts around the clock. Some of the men slept on cots pushed against the walls rather than go home to families they saw only rarely. Rochefort himself had stopped bothering with a full uniform weeks earlier, working instead in a smoking jacket over his undershirt, with carpet slippers on his feet, moving between the tables with a coffee cup that was rarely empty and rarely finished either. The room ran on very little sleep and an enormous amount of pressure, since everyone inside it understood that whatever they found, or failed to find, would determine how many men lived through whatever came next. Rochefort answered to no one comfortably. He had a reputation among some of his superiors for being difficult, blunt, unwilling to soften a conclusion simply because it was inconvenient for someone above him to hear it. That same bluntness was about to matter more than anyone in Washington yet understood. By late May of 1942, Rochefort believed his team had found something that could change the entire war in the Pacific. Japanese communications kept referring to a planned operation against a target designated only by the letters AF. Rochefort was certain AF stood for Midway Island, roughly 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. It was not a wild guess. His team had spent weeks building the case letter by letter, cross-referencing patterns, piecing together fragments of intercepted traffic, the way a man might reconstruct a torn photograph from scraps found in different drawers. To confirm it, Rochefort's team arranged for Midway's garrison to send a fake message, in the clear, complaining about a broken water distillation plant. Within days, Japanese communications referenced a water shortage at AF. It was as close to proof as code-breaking ever offered. But Washington disagreed. The Office of Naval Intelligence's code-breaking unit in Washington, known as OP-20G, argued that the coming attack was a feint. The real target, in their assessment, was the American West Coast, possibly California, possibly the territory of Alaska. The evidence Rochefort was using, they said, simply did not support his conclusion, and two of the most capable code-breaking teams in the Navy found themselves in direct disagreement over a decision that could not wait for a compromise. Every day that passed without a resolution was a day closer to a fleet movement that could not be undone once it began. Nimitz read both assessments. He read them the way he read almost everything, without visible reaction, without commentary meant for the men waiting nervously in the room with him. He asked careful, specific questions. He personally reviewed portions of the intercepted traffic himself, rather than relying entirely on summaries handed to him by his staff, sitting with the raw material the way a much younger officer might, unwilling to let rank substitute for understanding. He met directly with Rochefort's intelligence officer, Edwin Layton, a man who had known Rochefort for years and was willing to put his own credibility behind Rochefort's analysis without hedging. Layton told Nimitz plainly that he trusted the basement's work over the assessment coming out of Washington, and he said it knowing exactly what it would mean for his own career if he turned out to be wrong. Then Nimitz made a decision that, if wrong, would leave the American West Coast essentially undefended and send 3 of the Navy's last 4 Pacific carriers directly into a trap they would not survive. He sided with the man working in the basement over the official assessment coming out of Washington. He ordered all 3 available carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, still under repair after being badly damaged weeks earlier at the Coral Sea, to a rendezvous point northeast of Midway that the staff had nicknamed Point Luck. Navy engineers had told him the Yorktown would need 3 months in dry dock to be fully seaworthy again. When Nimitz personally inspected the damaged carrier in dry dock, he told the assembled repair crews that he needed the ship ready in 3 days, not 3 months. Workers swarmed the hull around the clock, welding through the night under floodlights, some of them sleeping in shifts on the dock itself rather than losing time walking home. Working around the clock, the yard crews had her patched and back at sea in 72 hours, still trailing repair crews finishing work below decks as she got underway. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet appeared off Midway, exactly where Rochefort had said it would. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz spent the day the way he spent most days, reading dispatches as they came in, revealing little to the staff officers who kept glancing toward him for some sign of what he was feeling. By that same afternoon, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning on the water, their flight decks wrecked, their aircraft destroyed, before most of them had even left the hangar decks. Historians would later call it the turning point of the entire war in the Pacific. The man responsible for the decision that made it possible was sitting in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor when the reports came in. There was no photograph taken of him at the moment of victory. He issued no dramatic statement to the press. He sent a short message to the fleet instead. Those who took part in the Battle of Midway that day had written, in his words, a glorious page in their own history. Then he returned to his desk and kept working, because the war had not ended. It had only turned slightly, and there was a great deal of it left. Even the men who had fought the battle did not yet fully understand what they had accomplished. It would take years and countless retellings for the scale of the victory to settle into public memory. The man who had made it possible seemed, by every account of those close to him, almost uninterested in receiving credit for the explanation. That was not modesty for its own sake. It was simply how he worked. And on the other side of the Pacific, officers in Tokyo studying the wreckage of their own fleet understood the shape of what had happened before most of Washington did. 3 months after Midway, the war in the Pacific looked nothing like a victory. On the island of Guadalcanal, roughly 8,000 United States Marines held a thin defensive perimeter around a half-built airstrip the Japanese had been constructing when American forces landed and seized it. The Marines named it Henderson Field. Taking the airstrip had taken less than 2 days. Holding it turned into something far harder and far longer. Japanese destroyers ran reinforcement convoys down through the Solomon Islands nearly every night, arriving with such reliability that the Marines gave the route its own nickname, the Tokyo Express. Every morning brought more Japanese troops onto the island. Every week, the American perimeter shrank a little further. Men inside that perimeter were down to 2 meals a day on the days they were fortunate, sometimes rice captured from Japanese stores when their own supply ships failed to arrive. Malaria had spread through every unit on the island, and men who had never been sick a day in their lives found themselves shaking with fever in their foxholes at night, unable to leave their posts because there was no one to replace them. A lone Japanese aircraft flew over the perimeter most nights, dropping occasional bombs at irregular intervals just to keep the Marines from sleeping, a routine the men came to know by the sound of its engine and gave its own bitter nickname. After losing 4 cruisers in a single night at the Battle of Savo Island in August, the Navy had pulled its surface ships back from the immediate area, leaving the Marines effectively alone on the ground, with the sea around them contested and unreliable. The officer commanding those Marines, General Alexander Vandegrift, sent message after message up the chain of command, describing a situation that was deteriorating by the week. The man responsible for the broader South Pacific theater was Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. Gormley had never once set foot on Guadalcanal himself. He ran his entire command from a transport ship anchored at Noumea, New Caledonia, roughly 600 miles from the fighting his own forces were engaged in. Working out of a cramped shipboard office, with communications equipment that frequently failed to keep pace with the speed of events on the island. His dispatches back to Pearl Harbor grew progressively darker through September and into October. In his own words, the situation had become critical beyond hope. He recommended that Washington reconsider its entire commitment to holding the island. Officers who worked near him during this period described a man who had stopped believing the campaign could be won and had begun preparing, in his own communications, the justification for that belief, rather than the plans to change it. In October, Nimitz did something none of his staff expected. He did not send back a message. He did not convene a review board or wait for a formal report. He flew to Noumea himself, walked aboard Gormley's ship, and spent an entire day going through every dispatch, every intelligence assessment, every supply report that had come out of the South Pacific Command since the Marines had landed in August. Officers present that day described the meeting as quiet and methodical rather than confrontational. Nimitz asked questions for hours, at times returning to the same report twice to compare it against something Gormley had said earlier in the day. He never raised his voice once. By the time he flew back to Pearl Harbor, he had made 2 decisions. Gormley would be relieved of command, and Guadalcanal would not be abandoned. He chose Vice Admiral William Halsey to replace Gormley, not because Halsey was necessarily the more skilled strategist of the two, but because Halsey would fight with whatever resources he was given, and fighting with whatever was available was precisely what the situation on Guadalcanal demanded at that moment. When Halsey received his new orders by messenger boat at Noumea Harbor, he read through them twice before looking up and telling the men around him that this was the hottest assignment anyone had ever handed him. He assumed command that same afternoon, with no transition period and no time to prepare a staff of his own choosing. Word of the change reached the Marines on Guadalcanal within days, passed along foxhole to foxhole, rather than through any formal announcement, and several veterans later recalled that morale on the perimeter rose noticeably simply from knowing someone new, someone known for aggression rather than caution, was now in charge of their fate. What Nimitz did after making that change is less remembered than the change itself. He issued no public announcement explaining his reasoning. His own name did not appear in the newspaper coverage of the command shift that week. Back at Pearl Harbor, he continued the same routine he had followed since January, working to make certain the right officers were positioned in the right roles, with whatever ships, aircraft, and supplies he could find for them. When reporters asked him directly about the situation on Guadalcanal, he told them the Marines were performing magnificently and that he had full confidence in the eventual outcome. He said this publicly at a moment when privately, according to the men who worked closest to him, the outcome was very much still in doubt. Inside his own headquarters, the situation maps told a considerably darker story than his public comments suggested. Japanese battleships shelled Henderson Field at night with a violence that shook men out of their foxholes and left the airstrip cratered by morning, forcing ground crews to fill craters with hand tools before dawn so aircraft could take off on schedule. 1,000 men had gone into the water during the Battle of Cape Esperance. The carrier Hornet, one of the very ships that had helped win Midway only months earlier, had been sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz. The margin for error kept narrowing, and every report reaching Pearl Harbor made the arithmetic of the campaign look worse than the one before it. In mid-November, word reached Nimitz that the Japanese were sending 2 battleships south, along with a full resupply convoy, down what the Americans had started calling the slot, aimed directly at reinforcing their positions on Guadalcanal. All Nimitz had immediately available to intercept a force that size was a badly mismatched squadron under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers, outgunned in nearly every category that mattered against battleships carrying guns that could put a shell through a cruiser's hull from miles away. He sent them anyway, because the alternative was allowing the convoy through unopposed, and unopposed was not an option he was willing to accept. On the night of November 13th, Callahan's ships sailed almost blind into the Japanese force in the narrow, island-choked waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Visibility reduced to almost nothing in the darkness and confused further by inconsistent radar readings across the squadron. The engagement that followed lasted less than half an hour, fought at ranges so close that gun crews could see the faces of enemy sailors lit by muzzle flashes, and several ships nearly collided with each other in the confusion of the night. Callahan was killed on the bridge of his own flagship early in the exchange, along with much of his staff. 2 American cruisers went down. 3 destroyers were lost with them. Hundreds of sailors went into the water in the dark. Many of them never recovered. The sea around Savo Island already thick with wreckage from earlier battles fought in nearly the same stretch of water. But the Japanese battleship Hiei was left mortally damaged, unable to retreat effectively, and was finished off the following day by aircraft from Henderson Field, the airstrip Callahan's sacrifice had ultimately helped protect. The resupply convoy behind the battle group turned back rather than pushed through. Henderson Field held. When the final accounting of the Guadalcanal campaign was compiled in February of 1943, 6 months after the first Marines had come ashore, the newspapers had already decided who the story belonged to. Halsey's photograph appeared on the cover of Time magazine that November, with a headline naming him the man who saved Guadalcanal. Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor for his defense of the island. Nimitz received a promotion to Fleet Admiral, the same 5-star rank eventually held by Halsey and by Ernest King, and went back to running a war that was, for the first time since it began, moving in a single, consistent direction. No reporter ever asked him directly how the Guadalcanal campaign had felt to command from a distance. Those who knew him well enough to guess suggested that if someone had asked, he would have answered briefly, thanked the men who had actually fought it, and moved the conversation elsewhere. Vandegrift himself later wrote that throughout the entire campaign, he never once received a message from Pearl Harbor even suggesting that withdrawal from Guadalcanal was being considered as an option. He meant it as a compliment to Nimitz's steadiness, and it was one. It was also, in its own quiet way, a precise description of how Nimitz worked. He did not announce the options he had already decided against. He simply removed them from consideration and let the men under him fight without the added weight of knowing how close the whole campaign had come, at several points, to being called off entirely by men far from the fighting, who had lost their nerve. Guadalcanal cost the Navy ships, aircraft, and thousands of men before it was finished, but it held, and holding it changed the shape of everything that followed in the Pacific. By the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Japan was no longer advancing anywhere. The United States was no longer simply defending what it held. Island by island, the perimeter that Japan had built at the start of the war was collapsing inward, closer with every campaign to the home islands themselves. In June, Nimitz sent the Fifth Fleet, roughly 350 ships, 900 aircraft, and 127,000 men, to seize the Mariana Islands. Command of the fleet fell to Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man who by nearly every account was the least visible senior officer in the entire Pacific theater. He gave no speeches. He avoided reporters whenever possible. He walked 10 miles every morning before his staff had even arrived at their desks, and he was reliably at his own desk before anyone else in the building. Nimitz had trusted him with command at Midway 2 years earlier, when Halsey fell ill just before the battle, and a replacement was needed on almost no notice. He had trusted him again with every major fleet action since. What happened in the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 would test that trust in a way neither man had fully anticipated. The Japanese had assembled their largest carrier force since Midway for the operation. 9 carriers carrying roughly 500 aircraft, under a plan the Imperial Navy called Operation Ago. According to post-war analysis of Japanese planning documents, the operation was built around a specific assumption about the American commander opposing them. The assumption was that Spruance would not abandon the landing force at Saipan to chase a carrier battle further out to sea, regardless of the opportunity that battle might present. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese fleet, built his entire strategy on that belief. His carriers would launch their aircraft from beyond the effective range of American strike planes, close enough afterward to land those same planes on airfields at Guam and refuel before striking again. It was a plan that depended entirely on Spruance behaving exactly the way Ozawa expected him to. On the night of June 18th, Spruance received an urgent message from his carrier task force commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, requesting permission to move the fleet west overnight in order to be in position to strike the Japanese carriers at first light. Spruance's own chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, one of the most capable officers the Navy would produce in that era, supported Mitcher's request without reservation. Their argument was direct. Move now, strike first, end the threat before it could strike them. Spruance read the message carefully, then he refused it. His orders were to protect the landings at Saipan, and he was not willing to leave those landings unguarded in pursuit of a carrier battle whose exact location could not yet be confirmed with confidence. He chose to wait, and the men on his own staff who disagreed with him spent that night watching the horizon, with the particular frustration of officers who believed history was slipping past them while their commander did nothing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded over the next 2 days. On the first day, Japanese aircraft attacked in successive waves, only to be met by American fighter pilots, directed with the benefit of radar and flying aircraft, with a decisive performance advantage. The sky above the fleet filled with smoke trails and falling wreckage for hours, gunners on the decks below counting kills they could barely keep track of. The waves were destroyed so completely and so lopsidedly that American pilots afterward began calling the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 373 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, 2 of them by American submarines operating independently of the air battle, the 3rd by carrier aircraft. By any conventional measure, it was one of the most decisive naval victories of the entire war. It was also, in the judgment of nearly every senior aviation officer around Spruance, a missed opportunity of enormous size. Mitcher was reportedly furious that the fleet had not been permitted to close the distance and finish off the retreating Japanese carriers directly. Burke would later call Spruance's decision to hold position the worst mistake of the war, a judgment he did not soften even years afterward. Admiral John Towers, deputy commander of the Pacific Fleet and one of the most respected men in naval aviation, wrote a formal letter to Nimitz demanding that Spruance be relieved of his command altogether. The letter was specific in its criticisms and carried the implicit support of much of the naval aviation community, a powerful constituency within the Navy that Nimitz could not simply dismiss without consequence. Nimitz read the letter. He did not respond to Towers directly, and no formal reply was ever sent addressing the demand itself. Instead, roughly a month later, when Admiral Ernest King visited Saipan in person, King pulled Spruance aside privately. What King told him has since been confirmed through multiple independent accounts from officers close to both men. He told Spruance that he had done a damned fine job, and that regardless of what other people might say to him about it, his decision at the Philippine Sea had been the correct one. Towers never received a formal answer to his letter. Spruance himself was never entirely certain he had made the right call. Years after the war, in a letter written to the historian Samuel Eliot Morison, he stated the doubt plainly. He believed that going out after the Japanese carriers and destroying them outright would likely have been more satisfying and more decisive than waiting for them to come to him. But the fleet had been at the beginning of a critical amphibious operation at Saipan, and he had judged that the landing force could not afford to be gambled with. He had doubted himself, and he put that doubt in writing for the historical record without softening it. The man who had defended him to King never expressed any comparable doubt at all, and the Japanese, reviewing the outcome of the battle afterward, noted something that the American officers arguing bitterly over Spruance's decision seemed to overlook entirely. Ozawa's plan had been built precisely on the correct assumption that Spruance would not leave Saipan undefended. Japanese intelligence had read the American commander accurately, and the plan had failed regardless. Not because their read on the man was wrong, but because correctly predicting caution did not guarantee a path to victory against it. There is a particular kind of judgment that does not announce itself, that looks from the outside like hesitation, or excessive caution, or even a failure of nerve. The Japanese had identified that quality in Nimitz from the very beginning of the war. They had built an entire fleet operation around identifying the same quality in Spruance. In both cases, their analysis of the man was accurate. In both cases, it cost them everything they had staked on it. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The battleship Missouri sat at anchor under an overcast sky, her decks crowded with Allied officers, photographers, and correspondents from nearly every nation that had fought in the war, the metal railing still cold with the early morning damp. On a table bolted to the deck in front of the forward gun turret lay the surrender document, 2 pages long, requiring 11 signatures. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the microphone and spoke for several minutes about what the moment meant for civilization and for the generations still to come before the first signature was placed. The Japanese delegation stepped forward next. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed first, removing his top hat and leaning heavily on his cane, having lost a leg to an assassin's bomb 13 years earlier. The generals signed after him, then the admirals. MacArthur signed the American copy using 6 separate pens, setting each one aside afterward for specific people he intended to give them to, including one for General Jonathan Wainwright, the officer he had once been forced to leave behind in the Philippines in 1942, who had spent more than 3 years in a Japanese prison camp and arrived at the ceremony still visibly thin from the ordeal. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He stepped up to the table, signed with a single pen, and stepped back without any further gesture. A yeoman handed him the pen afterward, and he placed it quietly in his pocket. One correspondent present that day wrote that evening that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly it would have been easy to miss that he had been there at all. In the weeks that followed, the newspapers filled with photographs and retrospective accounts of the war's final chapter. MacArthur was named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in occupied Japan. Halsey gave interviews to reporters eager for his account of the war's final campaigns. Spruance was profiled in several national magazines. Nimitz flew back to Pearl Harbor and turned to one remaining task before his command formally ended. He wrote his final report on the entire Pacific War, a document running several hundred pages, assessing every major campaign from December 1941 through August 1945. In it, he named the officers whose judgment he believed had been proven correct, and explained the reasoning behind the operations that had succeeded. He noted failures within the campaign without naming the individuals responsible for them. He submitted the finished report to the Navy Department. It received almost no press coverage at all. After the war ended, American intelligence officers reviewed the Japanese Naval General Staff's internal assessments of the men they had fought against. The documents had been maintained in Tokyo throughout the war, updated as the conflict progressed and revised as the balance of power shifted further against Japan. According to the historians who examined these records, the assessments of MacArthur focused heavily on his relationship with the press and with Washington, and on the political ambitions his conduct suggested. The assessments of Halsey focused on his aggression and his predictability under pressure, the same patterns Japanese planners had once tried to exploit directly. The assessment of Nimitz read differently from either of them. It returned again and again to a single trait, that he could not be provoked into acting before he judged the moment was right. Japanese analysts had tried repeatedly to read him through the men he chose to place in command: Spruance at Midway, Halsey at Guadalcanal, Spruance again at the Philippine Sea, searching each time for a pattern they could plan against. What they found instead, according to this post-war analysis, was that Nimitz chose differently nearly every time, not from inconsistency, but from a precise reading of what each specific situation required. Halsey, when speed and aggression were called for. Spruance, when patience and protection mattered more. There was no fixed pattern to exploit, because the judgment being applied was never mechanical. It was applied fresh to conditions that were never quite the same twice. Chester Nimitz died on the evening of February 20th, 1966, at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay. He was 80 years old. The Navy that had been his home for nearly 60 years provided the rooms where he spent his final years, much as it had provided nearly everything else in his adult life. His funeral was held 4 days later, on February 24th, what would have been his 81st birthday. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, on a hillside overlooking the bay he had spent his final years beside. The men buried beside him were not politicians or heads of state. They were the officers he had served alongside and trusted with the decisions that mattered most. Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner, Charles Lockwood, all of whom had arranged, while they were still living, to be laid to rest together in the same ground where they had once fought a war together. There was no elaborate ceremony designed for cameras, no attempt to mark the occasion as historic while it was happening. Just the men who had done the work, resting together in the way they had always preferred to operate while they were alive, out of public view, quietly getting on with what needed to be done, exactly as they had throughout the war that only one of them was ever asked to explain. Visitors to that hillside cemetery today often walk past the row without recognizing a single name on it, looking instead for the markers of men whose faces once appeared on magazine covers. Nothing on the stones points them toward the story that unfolded 4,000 miles away in Tokyo, the careful reports written about a man who could not be provoked, the plans built around predicting him that failed anyway. That story was never designed to be found easily. It was designed, like almost everything Chester Nimitz did, to work quietly, decide correctly, and let the results speak for themselves long after the man who made them had stopped needing anyone to notice.